Bienvenida a todos los que
So a warm welcome to all of you who are participating in this webinar. We have people from all over Canada and from different parts of the world in Latin America, Malta, a number of European countries, all the way to Cambodia. My name is Jenny Cafiso, and I am the director of Canadian Jesuits International. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar that we've entitled A Cry from the Amazon, Indigenous Communities Threatened by COVID-19. First off, I will give you some logistical information, how the webinar is going to proceed. To avoid distractions, we're going to mute all the microphones and turn off the cameras of everyone. Make sure then that your mic is muted and that your camera's off. Put your questions and comments in the Q&A box. Type them there and not in the chat box. Yes? And then we will group the questions together uh, for Anitalia and Alfredo to respond to them. The webinar will be recorded in both languages and will be sent to all participants. I would like to point out that we are connected with our colleagues in the Amazon right now. And of course, we've had some technical issues already. This is just.
Yo no escucho que estás hablando. No sé si hay un...
I can't hear you. I'm not sure why. Anitalia can hear and I can't. This is a voice we're hearing from Leticia, our colleague Valerio. So please have some patience with all of this. This is the reality we're living with. This is our second webinar about the impacts of COVID-19. The first one was with Father Nauras from Syria. And today, to strengthen our solidarity with our brothers and sisters, Alfredo is also saying he can't hear you, Jenny. The only one who can hear is... Okay, Valerio, I will let Victor or someone from my team to try to fix this for you, okay? And while I'm introducing the presentation. Someone's going to write to you.
Sí.
Entonces, quiero seguir con...
So continuing, despite the fact that we're in different places in the world, those of us who are organizing the webinar are in Toronto, and it is our practice to recognize the Indigenous territory where we do our work and where we live, to recognize these Indigenous peoples in the past and in our present, and the need to continue the work for Indigenous justice. Hello? Therefore, as CJI, we would like to recognize that the territory that we meet on is the traditional territory of a number of different Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is today the home of many different First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and individuals. We also recognize that Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 made with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also would like us to take a moment of silence now to recognize and remember all those who are grieving someone they've lost to COVID-19, including Anitalia, who lost her brother-in-law to COVID, all those who are sick, those who are frightened, and those who are suffering from hunger and poverty because of COVID. So let's take a moment now to remember them, a moment of silence.
Hoy Anitalia Pigliacci and Padre Alfredo Ferro.
Talia Pihachi and Father Alfredo Ferro are joining us from Leticia, which is a city in the Colombian Amazon region, bordering Brazil and Peru. Both work in the Amazon and participate actively in the defense of the Amazon. And first of all, I would like to introduce Father Alfredo, and after his presentation, I will introduce you to Anitalia. Let's pray that there are no more technical issues and that the connectivity will hold up. Father Alfredo Ferro is a Jesuit philosopher, theologian, and sociologist. Since 2014, he's been the coordinator of the Jesuit service for the Pan American region, based in Leticia, headquartered in Leticia, Colombia, where he is right now. In 2019, he participated in the Synod of the Amazon. He's worked for socioeconomic justice in Latin America as director of the Campesino Institute, where he was a social promoter, subdirector, director, also with the Program for Peace in Bogota. And for 6 years, he was the coordinator of the social apostolate of the Conference of Jesuit Provincials in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would also like to add that he is a great friend. I've known him for many years, and I respect and admire him tremendously for his commitment and for the way in which he's inspired us. So welcome, Alfredo, and over to you.
Buenos días con todos. Alfredo tiene algunos problemas técnicos.
Alfredo's having a few technical issues to hear, but now he can hear us, so you can continue now, Alfredo. Go ahead. And you can turn on your camera as well. If you can turn on your camera, Alfredo, so we can see you. Can you hear me? I don't know whether you can hear me. I can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Sí, Alfredo, te escuchamos.
Yes, Alfredo, we can hear you. You can continue.
Bueno, mi nombre es Alfredo.
My name is Alfredo Ferro. I am a Jesuit. I'm the coordinator of the Jesuit service, Pan-Amazonic Jesuit service. I'm in Leticia in the Amazon in the south of Colombia. A warm greeting to all of you. We're very gratified to know that you're present with us today, accompanying us. As you can see, we've had some difficulties with our internet connection, but we're hoping to resolve those, and I'm hoping that you can all hear me right now. And so I'm hoping to be able to share my presentation with you. Thank you, Alfredo. It appears that you can't hear us now. Alfredo has a presentation with slides, a PowerPoint presentation, and we're going to see whether we can share that screen with you. If there's a problem, then I would ask that we start with Anitalia until Alfredo can connect himself and share his presentation. Anitalia, are you able?
Sí, claro.
Okay.
Yes, of course. Yes. Perhaps until Father Alfredo can rejoin us and figure out his connection, perhaps you can take over and do your presentation first. Anitalia, can you turn on your camera? Is that possible? There you are. Wonderful. We can see you now, Anitalia. So I'm going to introduce you, and we'll give Alfredo the time to iron things out at his end. So I'd like to introduce you to Anitalia Pijachi. She is a Utota community leader and member of the coordinating commission of the ecclesial network of the Amazon, REPAM. She participated actively in the Synod of the Amazon. She will share with us how her community and her family are experiencing the threat of COVID-19. This has touched her very personally, her brother-in-law, more specifically, and we express our condolences to her. And she's going to speak to us about leadership and the important role played by Indigenous women and Indigenous women leaders through this period. We know that you are experiencing this drama in your own flesh, in your own family, and know that we are with you in solidarity. And Italia, over to you. And I'd like to point out that Anitalia traveled from her community to get to Leticia, to the city, to participate in this webinar. Thank you very much for doing that. Thank you. We can't hear you. You need to be louder. Yes, that's much better. A warm greeting to all of you who are listening in and watching all around the world and in Canada. This is a very important space to once again meet up and discuss something that, of course, none of us could have foreseen coming. None of us could have imagined it, this kind of a global pandemic. My name is Anitalia Pijachi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a member of the Aukaina people on my father's side and Witota on my mother's side. I live here in an indigenous reserve, Witota Reserve in Colombia, and we were able to get to Leticia. Today is the day when my ID card allows me to go out, and I have to get back before 3 because there's a curfew and there's no public transit after that time. So sharing this space with you to let you know how we're experiencing COVID through the various media platforms that I've been able to connect with. I've been keeping up to date with what's going on throughout the various networks in the Amazon, including REPAM. I can say that I'm well informed, not about everything, but because I've lived it myself, I can share my own experience. I have 20 minutes to share this with you. Anitalia, remember to put your microphone as close to your mouth as possible so that we can hear you. I have Alfredo behind me, sorry. Can you put your microphone closer to your mouth so we can hear? Yes, that's much better. Thank you. As I was saying, what has the pandemic meant for the original peoples, the indigenous peoples here in the Amazon? First of all, it was something we had not experienced before, but then we had this memory of the colonial period when the colonizers arrived and spread diseases like malaria, the flu, various pox, chicken pox, and other illnesses and diseases that killed many of our people. This all came back to us in the context of the current pandemic. What has happened with our families? Well, my family in particular, memories of my mother and father, but also this period of confinement, of isolation, the relationship with the jungle, with the forest, the relationship of not being in touch with some people, but also being in closer touch with members of the close family. These are the impacts that we've seen with our neighbors because we're close to them and we've had to stay in our homes in quarantine. Not knowing this disease has had a great impact on community life, life with our neighbors, life with our family, life with our friends, and how to cure. There's a great deal of insecurity in the scientific community with doctors and so on. And this has been another major challenge. The whole issue of food sovereignty, the economy, eating what we want to eat and what we need to eat. We see that our relationship to food has changed. Some were able to acquire or have been able to acquire over many years, and that came to us through the colonizers and has become part of our basic diet, as well as more traditional foods and medicines and modern ones like acetaminophen, aspirin. Many of us have to go to the cities to get those medicines that we can't get from the jungle, like detergents and some soaps, coffee, rice. This has affected the education system as well. We realize that we are very vulnerable in terms of uh, basically being abandoned by the state in terms of its responsibility towards our young people, children, and its responsibility has to educate them. Feeding our children as well has changed a lot in boarding schools where many of our young people go. In the Department of the Amazon has there's one city of Leticia, and then around it we have more than 60 communities. Within the department, within the province, we have 7 zones that are not incorporated, that are not municipalities, and where there's difficult access and education happens in boarding schools. These children have lost not only those schools, those spaces, and that education, but also the ability to be fed in those places. The issue of the territory, on the one hand, and this is known worldwide, there have been foreign invasions of our territories, and this pandemic has accelerated them. Those who come from the outside, colonizers and other economic interests, landowners, for them the pandemic is nothing. In fact, it's advantageous. They continue to colonize us and they step on our rights and our territories. They invade our spaces. And so we are experiencing this period as an invasion. Families are being displaced. There's violence being experienced in communities and families. And a number of other very difficult situations have arisen and are being lived by our peoples. In terms of healthcare and health services, the experience we've lived through with my brother-in-law, for example, where we realize that once again, all these years of resistance, of demonstrating, of advocacy, of pushing for our rights as Indigenous peoples, pushing for an appropriate health legislation, because the current law does not guarantee access to services, to fundamental health care, and to achieve a guarantee to access to public health. This has had a very negative effect on our communities, this lack of access, this lack of services. And there have been many, many deaths here in our communities. And now people are very suspicious. They don't want to go to the clinics or the hospitals or the emergency rooms because once they go in there, they know they won't come back. They've seen too many go and never return to their families. We also realize that the arrival of doctors, more than 26 in a first advanced group that came to support in the context of COVID, and then another 26 young residents and young recently graduated doctors and nurses. They're very young, they're very inexperienced, and these are young people who are still learning, still practicing, still learning their trade. They're white Western doctors who have worked in modern hospitals and don't necessarily know how to work in our communities. And this has had a great effect on access to health care. So we've developed a network for care. There was a protocol developed that was designed, but it's not being respected. It's not being implemented. After the death of my brother-in-law, it's been a month since he died, and they still haven't done the tests. They still haven't come to test my family, to do any contact tracing, those who were in direct contact with him, and those more widely in the community who had some contact with him. So we've been pushing for this. We've been asking that there be testing throughout the community. We've had many deaths. A number of the seniors in our community have died, and there's been no care from our health system. Indigenous people in Colombia, in theory, are covered under state-financed health care, but we don't have access to that basic right in reality. So we're faced with all these injustices, and so we ask for your solidarity and your help, and we demand respect of these rights and access to these basic rights. There has been this closing of ranks and exclusion of many people, sort of a cartel system when it comes to the healthcare system and who has access to it. And all of this creates a lot of precarity, especially in the rural areas, the areas where you can only access communities by way of rivers, by canoe, or there are no highways. Imagine what it's like for those of us who are living in the jungle, in the forest. So we are very vulnerable, even with regards to access to information and a platform for us to speak and to have our voices heard and our needs heard. I can share with you that the pandemic, with all of these negative aspects, has also brought many positive things with it. For example, return to the land. Many people who had left our traditional territory, who had gone to the bigger centers, to the city, to seek a better life, better economic conditions, more opportunities. You know, there's this image that in the city, life is better, you live better in the city, you have a higher standard of life, quality of life. Many of these families have been left, of course, without employment, without work in the cities. To live in the city, you have to have a job, otherwise you can't eat, you can't provide for yourself, your basic needs. You know, we can do without clothing and shoes, but we can't do without food. This is a basic human need. Many then, having lost their employment, came back to their traditional territories and are recognizing the importance of their home communities and of food sovereignty and of living in their home communities and the importance of the land and the territory and its riches. Other issues around sustainable tourism, ecotourism, we realized that this kind of tourism was not the path to strengthen our cultures and our communities, you know, selling our folklore, selling our crafts. Suddenly, when the tourists were gone, we had nothing to eat. We had nothing to sell, and so we had nothing, no revenue to support ourselves. So this was not a sustainable model either, relying on this kind of tourism. And so the indigenous person is recognizing once again and revaluing the fact that the land, the earth, our culture is not to be shown as a show, uh, as a form of entertainment, that our way of living is a way of relating to the land. The land is our relative. There are more than 500 indigenous peoples throughout the Amazon. In the Colombian Amazon alone, we are 35 different nations, 36 different nations. What else has the pandemic brought us? Greater revaluing and recognition of the knowledge of our ancestors, recognizing the plants we use for medicines, for headaches and coughs and fevers, and going back to more traditional diets that come from the forest. The pandemic has allowed us to cleanse as well, cleanse our minds and our spirits and our souls and our relationships amongst each other within our communities, our relationship with the water as well. We've revalued all of that. We've recognized its importance once again. And of course, we've become increasingly aware of the traditional aid model that has been very damaging in many ways, that we need to be self-sufficient. Suddenly now with the pandemic, so much of the aid has been cut off, so much humanitarian assistance has disappeared, and we realize we need to be dependent on ourselves and not dependent on those from elsewhere. In Colombia, we're seeing an experience of many young people trying to be in solidarity with indigenous peoples, trying to protect communities, trying to make sure that there's sufficient hygiene and cleanliness within communities so there's not contagion. We've also been able to see that the policies of our government, of all governments in Latin America, in fact, including the government of the United States and European governments, they do not truly, they are not in resonance with the realities of indigenous peoples on the ground and their needs. Afro-Colombian communities as well, campesino communities, peasant communities, subsistence farmers are not recognized, and their way of life and their needs are not recognized. You know, we've been here for thousands and thousands of years as indigenous people. What else has this pandemic showed us, and what else has it strengthened? Well, I can say that the whole system of protection from the state, you know, militarizing our territory, sending in the armed forces, controlling entrances and exits from our communities, forcing people to stay home in quarantine. This created a lot of problems within our families, within our communities. We've seen community members who have gone very far from their communities to bigger cities, often become addicted to alcohol and other substances. Puerto Rico, Puerto Alegria, other communities along the Putumayo River, along the border with Brazil. We've had to carry out a whole pedagogical exercise then around self-sufficiency. It's not enough we have to develop a new awareness, a new consciousness within the communities to love each other, to take care of each other, to look out for each other. Since March, we've seen that our grandparents have been the most affected by this pandemic. Those who live very close to the city of Leticia, which is the case of my community, have been severely affected, and we realized the degree to which we need to protect and take care of our seniors, of our grandparents. And we need to be aware of various levels of immunodeficiency and immunocompromise within the population. What has this meant for education? Well, the minister has said that the students all need to go back to school, particularly to high school for 10th grade and 11th grade. When all of our educational establishments throughout the Amazon, and I can say this is true throughout the Amazon, in all of the countries, our infrastructure does not guarantee that we can protect the lives of our children and the health of our children if they go back to school. None of our schools have running water, for example. In one classroom, there are 40 to 50 children, students. If we look at online learning, this is a total failure. Many institutions have tried to teach over WhatsApp and other platforms, but having WhatsApp is not free. You have to have a data plan to be able to use your device and to access these platforms. And there's no free Wi-Fi. Many people are not part of the digital economy, don't have access to these tools. We thought we'd be able to go back to an older system of schooling and to the basics, science, natural sciences, social sciences, physics, chemistry, math, and literature as the pillars. Those areas of knowledge would be fundamental for our children to learn and then be successful in life. So those are some of the issues around education and schooling. What else have we asked for? We've also realized that aid projects are not enough. Humanitarian assistance is not enough. We also realized that the city needs the countryside, agricultural production, the food that comes from indigenous peoples for the cities. This needs to be supported. There seems to be. Oh, I think it's fine now in Italia. Yes, I heard an echo in my ear. Sorry about that. Please continue. So the support to these agricultural processes, the communities that produce our food, this has been very much devalued, ignored. The food produced by women, for example, they are not receiving the prices they need to sustain themselves. They're producing organic harvests, organic produce, and they're not being remunerated in a way that is just for this contribution that goes to the supermarkets in Leticia. So there are no guarantees in that regard either in terms of just revenue for this work. Everything is so expensive now in Leticia. Rice costs 3,000 pesos. A kilo of sugar is unbelievably expensive. So there are a lot of public policy issues here that need to be addressed at a pan-Amazonic level. And this reality is showing us the degree to which COVID-19 has made us vulnerable and fragile. And Italia, thank you very much. We want to allow Father Alfredo to speak as well, and then have some time for questions. There have been a few already typed up in the Q&A box, so don't go anywhere so you can answer some of these questions, but it's been very interesting hearing your experience. And so stay tuned, stay on the call, please. We'll let Father Alfredo do his presentation, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anitalia. Thank you. So, Father Alfredo, I already introduced you earlier. I don't know if you heard the introduction, but given the limited time, we're just going to go straight away into your presentation. I've spoken about you, about your career and your life and the work you've done. So now we see the presentation on the screen. Excellent. And Anitalia, you can turn your camera off and mute yourself, but don't leave the call, please. So over to you, Father Alfredo. And you need to unmute yourself, Father Alfredo, so we can hear you. Can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you now. All right, so first I'd like to thank you again. We've had some technical issues, some problems with our connection, but I'm glad that I'm able to be with all of you and to share. I would like to present to you a PowerPoint presentation that we've prepared for this webinar. We wanted to do it as the first thing on the agenda, but in some ways I think it was great that Anitalia went first because she's introduced us to a number of the themes and they come directly from her lived experience, her family, the community where she lives. And what I'm going to do is give a more general, overall point of view, an understanding of the reality here on the ground in the Amazon. The presentation is called A Voice or a Cry from the Amazon. I am going to say next for the next slide because I don't have control over the PowerPoint presentation itself. What I would like then to place before you in this conversation, what I'd like to put on the table here is not only a sharing about where we're at, but also who we are, what is the current conjuncture, what is the current moment we're in, reality, and some reflections on what we are learning, what we are hearing from this COVID experience, from this COVID-19 reality. Can we go to the next slide, please? I don't see the next slide. If whoever is controlling the presentation can please go ahead. We're working on that, Alfredo. All right. As we wait, I would like to give you a general sense of the Amazon for those of you who are less familiar with it. This vast territory and the struggles and challenges that are experienced there, and how this territory is profoundly threatened especially in this moment of the global pandemic. And so we've prepared some information, some basic information that helps us to understand better this reality and so here's the second slide of the presentation. I hope you can see it, where you can see the various elements of my presentation. Here you see a map of the entire Amazon, and it's interesting to see that the Amazon is made up of 9 countries. Brazil, of course, has the largest percentage of the geographic area, 67%, but other countries like Colombia, half of Colombia is Amazon. 600,000 square kilometers, and many different communities. And that's just the reality in Colombia. In this next slide, what I want to show is the current reality, the present reality and problems associated with it. Most of the Amazon's inhabitants live in urban areas. 70% of the population is in urban areas, and only 30% is rural. So once again, this means that the problems are also urban, not only in the jungle, not only in the rural areas. And in this great Pan-Amazonic region, what is very present is an extractivist model based on the extraction of minerals. So there's mining, hydroelectric dams, oil, gas, roads and highways, deforestation, of course, the forestry industry, which is done often in a very irresponsible way. All of this having a great effect on climate change and the socio-environmental situation. The next slide shows us the reality and various challenges. The Amazon is a strategic region in terms of its water resources, its forest resources, and it has gone from being the backyard of all of our countries to be the central square. It's become really prime time, and it is sought after by many different economic interests and large multinational corporations and smaller companies too. The Amazon contains great wealth, biological wealth, biodiversity, a great cultural and human diversity as well within the Amazon. The next slide gives you a very quick overview. We don't have much time of how our indigenous population is quite significant. We're talking about 3 million indigenous people, many different nations, 385 different indigenous nations, and 240 different languages spoken in the Amazon region. To show you, and Anitalia referred to this as well, the wealth, the diversity of these peoples, of these various cultures, indigenous cultures present in this vast area. The next slide shows you how the church has a special pays a special attention to and particularly values these indigenous peoples. You see a text here from the Aparecida document, Aparecida 472, which says the church especially cherishes indigenous peoples for their respect for nature and love of Mother Earth as source of food, common home, and altar of human sharing. This photo is very beautiful and very evocative because it shows us the solidarity of the indigenous women with the greater natural world. She is giving her milk and her nourishment both to her human child and also to an animal. So she sees the animal as part of her family. She kneels down and gives her nourishment to another living species. The next slide, please. In this second part of the presentation, which I call About Us, I would like to begin with REPAM and the church in the Amazon. This church network, Pan-Amazonic Church Network, that was created 6 years ago, it's quite new, and it's a very interesting ecclesial network that wants to articulate all of the various activities and actions of the church throughout the Amazon. It wants to be in true service to the kingdom of God and wants to build relationships and links and connections to enrich our way of doing things as church in the Amazon, and that breaks down walls and barriers. The next slide, I think, shows us and summarizes what the mission of this network is, and how fundamental it was in the preparation of the Synod on the Amazon. Its basic mission is to develop in an integrated way the work of the church in the Pan-Amazonian territory. Next slide, please. There is here an image, a graphic, a star, really, that shows us visually how this network functions. 9 countries. It's a network that serves the church throughout the Pan-Amazonian territory, and has at its nucleus, at its heart, indigenous peoples and their spirituality, allows that spirituality to be truly incarnated, and it develops projects and programs in various areas: human rights, borders, training and formation, pastoral methods, and is in touch with a number of other international networks. We do a lot of work in communications, communications really for social transformation, and all of these interrelationships, all of these links are so important to our network. And the network really and ultimately offers services, including the preparation of the Synod, encouraging the strengthening of alliances, and the work done throughout the territory. Next slide, please. In the next slide, leaving behind Repam a little bit and talking more about the ecclesial, the current church moment in the Amazon, the current conjuncture. There are 3 inspiring aspects to our mission. First of all, the very important document, Laudato Si, and the way the Pope speaks about care for our common home, this desire for conversion, the Amazonian Synod that took place at the end of October, where myself and Anitalia and a number of others were in Rome, and we arrived at a final document that invites us to a conversion, an ecological conversion, a pastoral conversion, a structural conversion, and a synodal conversion as a church, to walk together as a church. And finally, the apostolic exhortation of our current Pope, Dear Amazon, it's called, where the Pope strengthens, reinforces the Synod documents, placing at the heart of his thinking hopes for the future and a vision for the future. So I think this is the moment we're in, and it helps us understand the current challenges we're faced with and how all of these documents and encyclicals help us. Let me now talk about the reality of Jesuits in the region. The next slide is a map, a very interesting map that was created by Father Samuel Fritz, a Jesuit who, at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, was able to create this incredibly detailed map. It's quite amazing, actually, given that we're talking about 1703. There were no satellites. So we see that he was able to travel widely throughout the region and give us quite an accurate depiction of this vast watershed and its one fundamental vein, the Amazon River, and all of its tributaries. So we're going to go back to the roots of the Jesuit presence, all the missionaries who came to these territories and gave their lives in many cases and died here and in service of Indigenous peoples, with, of course, light and darkness. Not all the chapters were glorious and beautiful. There was much darkness as well, but they're all important for us to remember and to root our work in today. Can we continue? The next slide has to do with, again, the Company of Jesus, the presence of the Jesuits throughout the region. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we don't have very much time, but what you see here, you see in yellow where Jesuits are present throughout the region, in Brazil, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Guyana, in the south of Colombia. We have both Jesuit works and Jesuit communities. There are 72 Jesuits, and there's a significant group of lay people as well, very involved in our works. It's very important to remind ourselves of this presence and also the Jesuit presence in other countries or in these same countries. We have more than 145 educational centers throughout the Amazon. We have a project for faith and joy throughout the region. And it's important to have this broad panorama of our presence throughout the region. So let's continue with the next slide then. I will go now into the actions and activities of our service, the Jesuit Pan-Amazonic Service, which sees the Amazon as a priority region and as a consequence desired to create this service, the SJPAM. There are a number of us, 18 actually, in this border region between Brazil and Colombia. And it's a concrete way of manifesting this engagement, this commitment to the region. I'd like to go on with a few of the elements of what it means to be on the ground, what we actually do as a service, as an SJPAM. What would we like to do? Where are we headed? One thing that's very clear is that we want to listen to the cry of the Amazon. We want to hear and listen to the cries of the earth and the poor. And we see this echoed in the various documents I mentioned earlier. That our priority is the defense and promotion of life and a sustainable environment in the Pan-Amazonian region. And as I said earlier, why do we do this? Because the order, the Jesuits want to accompany the Amazon, want the Amazon to be a priority of their mission. There are many ways of doing this, but very concretely, we are trying to have both a presence, a relationship with all of the various networks throughout Latin America. And so our mission is to articulate and to make interconnections, build alliances and relationships between the peoples of the region. The next slide then. In this slide, we explain the focuses of the project. Since the beginning of the project, that is the SJPAM, we saw that it was necessary to have two axes, two basic focuses. First of all, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, they are at the heart of our work. And then also social and environmental sustainability. All of the actions then that we carry out, all of the projects, we always evaluate them according to these two lenses, according to these two focuses which are at the heart of our work. And I think for the company itself, for Jesuits, these are fundamental to our vision and our mission. Can we continue then with the next slide? To understand a bit where exactly we're situated, we have these two maps that will help you. First of all, the first map, you see that little orange square that shows us where we are more broadly within South America, between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. And then you see the smaller map to the right, zoomed in, where you see the borders between the three countries. Colombians in the north, in the pink area. Peru is green, the Loreto region of Peru, and then the yellow area, Alto Solimões, area of the Brazilian Amazon. And Italia commented, shared this a bit. It's a great challenge for us to work in this tri-border area and to extend our service throughout the region. So we'll continue with the next slide, the fourth portion of my presentation, which has to do now with the reality of COVID-19. To go a bit further into depth, and Italia already went there for us, but some stats, some numbers. The pandemic arrived later than in other areas of the world, Europe, for example, and China. On the 13th of June, the 19th of June, sorry, we had more than 33,000 infected and 12,000 deaths. And of those, more than 1,000 indigenous people dead in 120 communities from COVID-19. In more than 120 different nations, different indigenous nations. So in the Brazilian Amazon, which of course is the majority, both population-wise and geographically, we have 320,000 diagnosed with COVID-19 and more than 12,000 deaths. And here in a small city in Colombia, 50,000 inhabitants, we have more than 2,500 diagnosed cases and close to 100 deaths. And for a city of 50,000 people, this is a very high number. And there's a very, of course, understandably serious concern. There are effects, widespread effects of the pandemic, unemployment, economic distress, hunger, fear, insecurity. This is widespread and creating a great deal of insecurity and precariousness. Next slide, please. What are the effects on the indigenous people of the Amazon of COVID-19? First, I should say that indigenous peoples are in a great deal of vulnerability already, even before COVID-19, and as a consequence, it's easier for them to become infected. And they are also targets of discrimination, victims of many forms of discrimination. The health system is overwhelmed and not able to provide proper medical care. The health system has essentially collapsed. The state abandoned the health system years ago, has underfunded it, and this is creating very difficult situations. There are no ICUs, for example, in the region. Anyone who needs intensive care has to be sent to Bogota. And of course, there are no roads. You can only get there by plane. And of course, the great sadness around the loss of our elders, our grandparents, our seniors who are dying. They are human libraries full of so much ancestral knowledge, and seeing them dying is very painful for the indigenous peoples of the region, for all of us, in fact. Next slide, please, to show you here that many communities that relied on tourism, the sale and commerce of crafts, are now experiencing hunger and many other difficulties, economic and otherwise. The market is basically evaporated, has disappeared, and there's nowhere to sell these goods and services anymore. Many communities have become isolated, and many individuals won't go to the hospital for fear of catching COVID-19. And they many times are trying to use medicinal plants for treatment. They don't want to go to the hospitals. They're very fearful. They don't know whether they have COVID-19. They don't know whether if they go to the hospital, they will get it there. And to conclude, two final points on the last slide here. And this is a question for all of us. What are we doing to fight COVID-19? What are we doing faced with this reality? We are trying to accompany these communities, offering humanitarian assistance, medicines, PPE, other tools that are urgently needed on the ground. And then we are also trying to work in the area of prevention, various safety and security, health protocols, training and awareness raising, allowing the communities to respect these protocols as much as possible. That's why information sharing and communications is so fundamental. And REPAM has done some very interesting work in the area of mapping the various contagions, the various hotspots, people who have died, and the realities of indigenous nations in various parts of the territory. The next slide complements the one I just showed you. What else are we doing? Well, we know that we also have to do political advocacy. This is fundamental. The government authorities, municipal authorities, we need to raise awareness with them. We need to push them and pressure them and do political advocacy work with them so that they step up and provide the services or stop doing things that are actually damaging these communities. We need a holistic and integrated approach and to carry out the networking work both within the church and also with broader civil society networks. We've created a very interesting and effective network where within SELAM, where we're identifying various needs. And then finally, of course, we're looking for financing, greater economic resources. We're doing fundraising. There's been the support of a number of different international NGOs, friends and family members who have supported us, individuals, civil society organizations, and other donors. The last slides to conclude has to do with lessons learned. What have we learned from COVID-19? There could be a very long list, in fact, but I would like to concentrate on a shorter list. First of all, we really have been able to confirm and affirm the message from our Pope in Laudato Si. That is, he had already shown to us very clearly in this document that there is a socio-environmental and economic crisis that we're in, a socio-environmental crisis, and that there's a parallel between this crisis and COVID-19, the effects on health, the environment, and the poor. And on the other hand, COVID-19 brings awareness that we are not in the same boat, although we are in the same storm, we're all faced with the pandemic, but not everyone is affected in the same way. This pandemic shows us that in the moment of truth, we are not all affected in the same way. Yes, we are all experiencing the pandemic, but there are those who are more vulnerable. Some boats are floating and some are sinking. And finally, this last slide, we feel that it's very important to reflect on our system, our current model of society. We cannot go back to a quote-unquote normal. The Pope has warned us about this, and it continues to repeat this. We need to analyze the economy we're in. Not any old economy will do. We can't go back to the way we've lived in the past. We can live with less, we can consume less, and we can eat healthy and recycle. So this deep analysis that needs to take place of our economic model, of our economic system that we currently live under, and that we can't go back to normality. I place the word normal in quotation marks, because even though many of us really want to go back to normal, we need to go back to a new reality. And this pandemic has shown that in spades and has taught us that. And finally, this pandemic has taught us that we can live with less, we can consume less, that we can eat a more healthy diet, and that we can reuse and recycle much more. This is also the call from our Pope. So thank you very much. This is the last slide to say that we want to embrace the Amazon. We want to continue together along this path in this mission. I thank you all for your presence and for your solidarity with us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Father Alfredo and Anitalia, for your presentations. Despite all of the technical difficulties that we've had, there was not a good internet connection with our friends and colleagues in Leticia, but we've found solutions using other devices, using cell phones, and we're very thankful. We see Father Valerio behind Father Alfredo, who's supporting Alfredo there in Leticia. Thank you very much. Despite all of these challenges, we were able to hear your presentations, and I know that we said we would finish at 2 p.m. Toronto time, Eastern Daylight Time. We're now 10 minutes behind, but I understand that some of you need to go, and that's fine. However, I suggest for those of you who are able to continue for another 10 minutes, not any longer than that, to answer a few questions. There are about 20 questions, but we've grouped them together into common categories. And as the questions were coming in, I don't know whether it was telepathy at work, but Alfredo actually answered them as they were being asked in his presentation, so that's excellent. Perhaps I will bring up some of the other questions. And for those of you who are leaving, this webinar will be available to you afterwards on our website. It's being recorded in both languages. So let's continue for another 10 minutes. A few questions here. One has to do specifically with COVID-19, and then there's a whole series of other questions to do with the system, the current reality, the current situation, the resistance and struggle of Indigenous peoples, and how we can support them in this resistance and struggle. The question about COVID itself, some of this has already been answered. One question specifically for Anitalia about the situation in her community, but there's a series of questions also on how Indigenous people are being able to resort to and contribute their own traditional ways of doing, how they've managed the pandemic using their own resources and their own community ways of doing things. Is there a social movement, an organized social movement around this in Leticia and in the Indigenous communities to face COVID from an Indigenous point of view? So those were a number of the questions we received, and then we'll go on to the others. I don't know which of the two of you wants to respond. Perhaps it could be Alfredo or perhaps Anitalia. If you can turn your video back on, Anitalia. You're welcome to answer this question. I would, I think, allow Anitalia to begin, and I can complement her answer. We need to be as brief as possible because we want to hopefully move on to another 2 or 3 questions, but I think it's important that we have this time to reflect and respond to these questions. So go ahead, Anitalia, you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you, unfortunately. There we go. Okay.
Todavía, Anitalia.
You're still muted, Anitalia. Let's see if we can hear you now. Can you speak? No, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. We can't hear you, Anitalia, unfortunately.
Ahí está.
Yes, now we can hear you. Yes, yes, go ahead. So what have we done in terms of indigenous movements, mobilizing and organizing? Our organizational structure in Colombia, well, we have 2 big representative bodies. One is the ONIC, which is the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia, and then we have the OPIAC, which is the organization that represents the indigenous peoples of the Colombian Amazon. And we have a protocol as well for all of the indigenous nations in Colombia. Some are specific to some territories and some are nationwide. So there have been denunciations and formal actions in the court system. We've received support both throughout Colombia and internationally. We've had visits from various international bodies, including the WHO, special rapporteurs from the UN, RCN, a number of different institutions that are trying to broadcast far and wide the reality on the ground for indigenous peoples in Colombia in the context of the pandemic. This was done very quickly because it's urgent. You know, we want to live, and we developed a number of protocols for the Indigenous Guard to protect communities. In my community, we couldn't close because the highway goes right through the middle of my community, and it's the only highway that gives access from Leticia to the rural areas. So we couldn't close our community, and that was one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest difficulties for us in the context of COVID. All of this fellowship, solidarity, and cooperation with different NGOs, the universities, especially the National University, they all did their best to lend us a helping hand, having access to clean water, teaching and pedagogical tools for hand washing and other sanitation and hygiene issues. We've been working a lot on, of course, traditional medicines, our traditional indigenous sources of knowledge in the forest, planting once again our traditional crops that our grandparents, our grandmothers, grandfathers have always told us need to be around our homes, in our gardens, in our subsistence gardens, in our vegetable patches, so that we can depend on them when we can't access Western medicine. We have nurses, one in particular who has been very active, going around on her bike, making sure that people are seen, children, women, as Father Alfredo said. In the case of my family, for example, after the death of my brother-in-law, we didn't want to send anyone else to the clinic or the hospital. So we are doing treatment within our own homes. What else have we strengthened? Well, there's been a lot of strengthening of leaders, support for leadership, the importance of the networks. We need to always see ourselves as human beings. This has been heightened during COVID. It's not about whether an NGO, is our partner or not, whether the government is present on the ground or not. We need to value our own strengths and see ourselves as human beings with dignity, with human rights. We defend our lives, we defend the broader life of the Amazon, and we defend our community. This is at the heart of what we continue to do through the pandemic. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much, Anitalia. I don't know whether Alfredo wanted to add anything. Yes, I think Anitalia's answer is excellent. I think there's a very important point, and that is that organizations and communities are the protagonists, are the main actors. All of the assistance and aid has gone through them, and that's fundamental to underline, to repeat. Recently, we had a very interesting dialogue asking them, what are your urgencies? What are your emergencies? Looking beyond this current COVID moment to a more distant horizon, and they immediately said food sovereignty needs to be at the heart of what we do going forward. Strengthening food sovereignty. There's very interesting work being done between the indigenous peoples of the Amazon and their representative body, the UNIAC, and other organizations, building links and relationships and strengthening that work. I think there are many questions on mines, anti-personal mines, on the extractivist model. We won't be able to answer all of those. I'm sorry to the participants on the call, but we will be able to continue this conversation in other spaces on the website. But I did want to mention something that's very important. There are a number of questions on solidarity, how we can contribute, what we can do. And there are a number of questions on how to support indigenous communities, original peoples, so that their autonomy is respected, and specifically how to establish some twinning relationships between indigenous communities in the Amazon and North American indigenous communities. There is a movement here as well, a very important movement of indigenous peoples who are struggling for their sovereignty, for their independence. And so there's a question to that effect. Are there any ideas about how to strengthen these relationships and maybe provide for more twinning opportunities between communities? I would start then with an idea. I think that from the outside, it's very important to pressure governments, particularly the governments who are violating indigenous human rights. One example that is really flagrant is Brazil. Brazil is in a very precarious situation, a very difficult situation in terms of how the government has managed the pandemic and how indigenous peoples are being treated during this pandemic. A total lack of regard for their territories and their rights. So I think there's some very important advocacy work that needs to be done. And you know this in Canada, I think, and this is fundamental in this regard, is denouncing Canadian mining corporations and extractivist companies that are creating environmental and social disasters here. We know that you have shown your solidarity in this regard, but we need to open more eyes in Canada and around the world about the activity of this extractivist model of these big mining multinationals that are very problematic and act in very irresponsible ways. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. A number of them are Canadian. A number of these corporations are Canadian. Thank you. Anitalia, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
Bueno, sí, algo así, eso es como muy grande, ¿no? Y yo creo que esa es la voz que siempre hemos
Yes.
tenido y creo que eso fue
You
bien
know, your
importante
continued
para
voice,
nosotros
raising of your voice, in the Synod document, this is quite clear.
a mirar
Also in
esta
the
situación
Dear
de
Amazon
las
statement of the
organizaciones
Pope,
ecotonómicas que sabemos, ¿no?
respect for
Que
Mother
hoy
Earth,
en esta pandemia,
uh,
mientras estamos en confinamiento,
for Mother Nature. In this period of confinement and quarantine,
este
uh,
espacio
the companies haven't stopped. They're not in quarantine. They're not in isolation. They're going full steam ahead, and they're present on our territories and continuing their extractivist work. So that our voices need to continue to be heard. We need your support. We know that you have the tools and the means to amplify our voices and to raise your own voices with your own governments and to continue to do the work in international networks. So we need to continue to strengthen our own community processes, support for our local economies too. Our economies need to be supported with a number of goods and services that come in to better the goods and services that we can produce and also the revenue and prices we receive for them. What else have we realized? That thanks to all of these contributions, we need to be careful with this humanitarian aid model, the traditional aid model from abroad that has in many cases damaged us more than it's helped us. So we need to unite in a true brotherhood and sisterhood, and that with the help that you provide us, we need to be analytical and critical of the model. In my community, for example, 2 years ago, we started working on a project to process fruits. We have many different fruits in our communities that we harvest throughout the year, and we've received international support to build this infrastructure, to build this processing plant. We know what we like to eat and what we want to produce, and we are not communities that produce soya, for example, or eucalyptus. We do yucca and piña and sugarcane, pineapple. So we need to be respectful of what international assistance needs to be respectful of what the needs are on the ground, and what we want, what our communities want, what our priorities are. And then support technological assistance and technical assistance that we don't currently have that helps our work be easier. What else? Help with animal husbandry and raising of various animal species, ducks and others, which we've learned now to produce and eat. This also helps with food sovereignty because it can be done on a small scale. Families can have this on their own land. Coming back to the traditional seeds that we've planted, we can have all the titles in the world and rights on paper, but we need to also hold on to our ancestral knowledge and seeds. We need to continue to share these seeds and know how to use them in our communities. Many of them have disappeared or are being kept far away from us. We don't have access to them. So this seed sharing needs to continue and be reinvigorated. We live in a tropical rainforest, in a tropical jungle, and so we need seeds and species that adapt to the soil here. We can't have species that do well in dry climates and arid climates and so on. there's so much more we can do in terms of sharing this this assistance and this knowledge in a post-pandemic period, so that we're not caught off guard the next time. The pandemic, of course, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, is not something brand new for our peoples, because we lived with other pandemics in the past that were brought to us from distant shores by colonizers. So thank you very much. And Italia, I think we will have to conclude here. There are many, many more questions, but I would just say that we will have more spaces for dialogue, and we'll have to create those spaces. Thank you for your participation from all over the world, including participants in as far away as Cambodia. I would like to first of all thank Anitalia for having left her community very early in the morning. I can't imagine what time you had to leave to get to Leticia to participate. So we thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and know that we are with you in this difficult moment for you and for your family, in this moment of grieving for your brother-in-law and others in your community. And I think your words have touched us deeply, have moved us, and we feel very close to you. Also, a big thank you to Father Alfredo, a great colleague and friend for over many years. Thank you for overcoming the various technical challenges we've had. I think it's amazing that we were able to pull it off in the end from Leticia in the heart of the Colombian Amazon. And I know that you are following what's going on the ground with regards to the pandemic very closely. We appreciate your testimony, your ongoing commitment, and we look forward to seeing you again in Canada so that we can meet with you face to face again and embrace you and hear about all of these realities in person. I would like to thank all of those who have accompanied us today, and I'd like to thank our great interpreter, who there have already been some comments saying that the interpretation has been excellent. And of course, he's had the challenge of interpreting my Spanish. Thank you to my team at Canadian Jesuits International, all of the staff who are exceptional, who have helped us to organize this event and to iron out all of the technical kinks and challenges we've had. I would also like to remind you that we will be sending the recording to all the participants, and I'd like to invite you to visit our website, where you will find more anecdotes, more stories about the work that we support, the projects we support, what CJI does, and also remind you of the COVID campaign that is ongoing to support this kind of initiative, not only in the Amazon, but also in other countries around the world where people are suffering. Often the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the poor, the poorest in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. Also, I invite you to visit CEPAL's website. I know we have a number of participants from CEPAL who are on the call. The president of CEPAL, they have a YouTube channel on their website where you can see other webinars that have been carried out on the Amazon. Interesting testimonies and analyses. So please stay up to date. Also on our website with regards to upcoming webinars that we'll be organizing. We wish you all, wherever you are, all the best. Let's continue working. Let's continue being in solidarity, working for justice and hope and safety and health for all, and continue to accompany people like Alfredo and Italia and Valerio, whose name we see on the screen. We know he's working as well with Alfredo. So thank you to all of you, and we'll see you soon.